evening, depending on where you are. We are starting now the fifth gathering of the cycle of debates organized by RIDRIP. My name is Alain, and I am a lawyer on the working group together with the ABIA, and we belong to the Brazilian Network for the Integration of Peoples, REBRIP, and today I am replacing the moderator Pedro Village that will come shortly, and he's the coordinator of the Working Group on Intellectual Property, and he will arrive soon. First of all, I would like to introduce the Working Group on Intellectual Property. We have 18 organizations of civil society, and since 2003, we work with the relationship with intellectual property and the right to health with public interest perspective, independently with any type of relationship with the pharmaceutical industry. So this event, as I said, belongs to a cycle of debate promoted by this Brazilian Network for the Integration of Peoples and works with new commercial and financial actors that are consolidating themselves in those changing times. And today, we will be discussing a bit the relationship between the intellectual property and the pandemics, emphasizing the important mobilizations of the civil society to defend health, to decrease any problems in terms of the pandemics. I would like to thank, first of all, REDRIP because of the organization, and I would like to thank all the participants, Susanna, Clara, and Danielle, who are going to speak, the speakers, and everybody that is here. And before we actually go on and pass the floor to the speakers, and before we actually start, I would like to say a few things. First of all, we will be transmitting the event in Portuguese, English, and Spanish, and will be available afterwards for those who want to watch it later on. And you will find the link for each one of the languages in the description of every video of the YouTube. Apart from that, it is important to emphasize that an article on the theme of this event will be made available on our page of the Brazilian Network for the Integration of Peoples, and then we will have a deeper discussion on every one of the aspects. The time for every speaker will be from 15 to 20 minutes, and in the end, we will have questions and answers that can be sent through the chat of the YouTube. So I would like to now pass the floor to the first speaker, Susanna Baria, who is the coordinator of the campaigns of the International of Public Services. Susanna, please. Good morning. It is a great pleasure to be here with you today. And to start, I will make a small presentation of our organization. So we cover basically all public servants of basic services and public services, and we work to strengthen the different trade union rights. And part of what we do is actually to work on the consequences of commercial agreements. And part of that, we have been working I work in India, and I coordinate also different works. So to start, let's pass on to the next slide. So Latin America has been very much affected by the pandemic. So we have 1.3 million lives lost. Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, and Colombia, for example, have very high rates, and the pandemic hasn't finished. So we have more and more cases because we knew variants that are creating concern in the region, basically gamma and lambda. So the World Health Organization has actually mentioned that there are many different social problems as a result of that. So we have also economic impacts, and it has affected lives of people in a dramatic way. We have very slow vaccination campaigns and shortages, and this actually creates the risk of different variants. And this happened. Only 16.6% of the people in Latin America are completely vaccinated, have received the 2 jabs. So we have, for example, here the numbers on the screens, for example. Within this context, an important thing would be that in the Latin America, there are many different agreements with the main pharmaceutical industry to try to assure jabs, but it hasn't worked. Because some countries actually accumulated most of the vaccines that were available.
Sin utilizar en América Latina y en otras partes del mundo. América Latina tiene una historia.
So Latin America has a history of a vaccine production capacity concentrated in a few countries. So here, for example, we have Cuba and Brazil that produce 73% and 54% of the vaccine needs. So Cuba actually is one of the leaders in technology transfer in the region. Nevertheless, almost none of the vaccines that are being used in Latin America have been produced in the continent. Nevertheless, we have, with some exceptions, like the agreement with Mexico and Argentina. The case of Cuba is very interesting because it is a moment where many countries realized that they had to develop their own vaccines. And because the production is concentrated in the north, and Cuba has been suffering a very fierce blockade from the United States. And so they cannot rely on foreign vaccines. And that's why they invested in their own vaccines. So they developed their own vaccines. Years of public investment actually support their research. But this thought can be seen in other countries. In Malaysia, for example, in Asia, in Thailand, after a lot of delay in receiving the vaccines, the public universities started to develop a new vaccine based in the RNA technology. Why do they have to invent a new vaccine? It's not very efficient. It doesn't solve the production problems. Perhaps it would be better to allow that the company that is qualified could produce a vaccine that has been discovered to save lives. In order to do that, and especially when we think that the research, the scientific research behind most of the vaccines have been financed with public funds. We don't do that because the international standards on the protection of the intellectual property don't actually allow it. The agreement of the WTO gives the companies a privilege and monopoly on their patents. And this so they have the privilege of actually being able to keep secret their formulas. So what is the minimum price that you can charge? And even if the vaccines can be exported, for example. And in fact,
Perdón, de verdad, es que tenemos mucho eco de tu Aldo, así que las
we have
traductoras...
too much echo. So the translators are having difficulties in translating. Perhaps, I don't know whether you have, can you change the place where you are or your headphones in order to improve them? Is it better like that? No, no.
Tal vez si cambias de sitio.
¿Y así? ¿Está mejor?
¿Está mejor?
A ver si me entienda mejor. Sí, me cambié la habitación. A ver, un poco mejor, pero no mucho. ¿Y aquí está mejor?
Sin fones, tal vez.
Ah, bueno, perfecto. Entonces ya encontré otro espacio, pero aquí hay menos luz. Entonces no estoy seguro cómo va a funcionar con la cámara.
Creo que todo bien. El labio... No, está bien, está bien.
Bueno, perfecto.
Perdón, puedes continuar.
Entonces, siguiendo con la discusión.
So following the discussion.
Estaba hablando de las patentes y
I was talking about the different patents and the right of the companies that can actually have the monopoly of, and in fact, they end up restricting the production of vaccines. What does that mean? That the shortages that we have to face now, that we're facing now, are artificial. It's unfair and it is absurd, because all of us need to be healthy in order to save everybody. So that's why the South Africa actually made propositions in actually suspending those agreements on intellectual property. And that is a crucial step in order to be able to develop more jobs, in order to stimulate many of the public services and many of the organizations of civil society all over the world. So that's our proposal, the TRIPS waiver proposal that has been proposed on the 2nd of October and proposes that those that belong to the WTO should actually, there should be the suspension of the intellectual property right under the TRIPS for health technologies, materials or components, methods and means of manufacture, and the scope of provisions and copyright, industrial design, etc., protection of undisclosed information. So basically what it means is what India and South Africa are proposing is that there should be an extension of many patents, and copyrights, industrial design, patents, and the protection of non-disclosed information. So there are many different articles that have a consequence on the production of health technologies, and all of them are very important in this discussion. As the idea is to cover jabs, but isn't restricted to jabs. So therefore, you need to cover medication, diagnostics, equipment, etc. The idea would be at least for 3 years, and until the moment as the exceptional circumstances actually stop existing. And those are the legal articles that exist within the World Trade Organization. The suggestion is for the extension to cover not only the final product, but also the different steps, the methods, the components that are necessary in order not to have any problems in terms of the production of those technologies because of the lack of materials. This should be applicable to all the members, but it isn't compulsory. Any country that doesn't want to renounce to their intellectual property could actually do it. And this is extremely important, taking into account that there are very few, that are some countries that are actually opposing to this proposal. And when we think that they could actually just allow this extension to happen in order for, then they can just choose not to use it. So this proposal is co-sponsored by 65 countries, and it is also supported by different international organizations like the World Health Organization, etc., UN human rights organizations, etc., trade unions, CSOs, etc. So this would be a support through a great amount of social actors, of course, with the exception, of course, of the pharmaceutical industry. So the next slide, please. So if we look here about the negotiations, from the beginning, in October 2020, when we actually had the proposal, the negotiation was actually stopped during 6 months, with many rich countries blocking the negotiation. The change of the Biden administration at the beginning, when the commercial representative of the United States announced that the United States was open to renounce to the intellectual property right, even though exclusively for the jab, was quite radical, given that the United States usually supports the patent system all the time. And this changed the dynamics. And from then onwards, the other countries started to vote for or against the position of the United States. So in the meeting of the APEC at the beginning of June, the United States and China, they support a declaration that actually neutralized politically the opposition, like Canada, Singapore, Japan, that opposed the whole process. And suddenly they were in a very delicate position without being able to express their opposition that clearly. Now we have 4 main positions from the different countries within the World Trade Organization. As mentioned before, there are many countries that are supporting the whole process. There are some countries that agree with the idea of suspending the protection of the intellectual property, but they are not completely in agreement with the proposal from South Africa, like, for example, the United States, China, and New Zealand. And there are very few, some countries that support text-based negotiation, but do not waive the IP, like, for example, Singapore, but also Brazil and Mexico. And these countries, usually they're quite complicated because they pretend not to oppose the negotiations, but in fact, they are creating many obstacles during the negotiations. And there are many different countries that actually deny the extension that there would be actually any positive effect. So we have the European Commission, for example. Those are the countries that oppose the tax-based negotiations altogether, like basically Germany, UK, South Korea, and Switzerland are the four main blocks that are against this idea. And it is important to emphasize that the position of the EU is very important, and the European Parliament actually supported the extension, and that a growing number of parliaments and governments are actually supporting or at least interested in participating. So this would be a position and attitude that could be quite much stronger if compared to the different countries within the European Union. What we're discussing now basically are four main elements: the extension, the duration of this extension. A minimum of 3 years is not that long, and it is necessary to have a certain amount of years that could offer at least some capacity of forecast. And this is one of the themes that is being discussed. And another question is the scope of the whole thing, including, of course, we're including the jabs, but we don't know the agreement of all the countries in order to be able to include medication, diagnostic tests, and protection equipment. The scope of the intellectual property, and then we have the commercial secrets that has to do with the process of obtaining the approval for the new technologies. And this has to do with the data of the assays, for example, the clinical assays that the regulators usually have to still consider secret commercial secrets, and the information cannot be used for now in order to be able to produce more products. So we would have to extinguish or to stop this regulation in order to be able to produce products from other manufacturers. And finally, the fourth question has to do with the national implementation, and it has to do with the requirements from the different countries and how they will actually use this extension. And then we have to recall that the extension means that the countries that do not want to use it don't need to use it, don't have to use it. The next slide, please. I would like to go back to the fact that in the last month, there was a feeling of urgency, of emergency in terms of the use of this extension. And since June, the discussions of the WTO had meetings every 2 days. And it is important to say that the pressure of the civil society, includes the unions, contributed for this process to be very interesting and had been drawing the attention. And just would like to give you an example of this. In the moment in which Angela Merkel was going to visit the United States in June, and there were many activities that had been organized for that occasion. For example, the different civil society organizations organized many demonstrations in the different countries in front of the German consulates, but there were also different conferences and press conferences and different actions, like, for example, in front of the Pfizer offices, and also the different, our affiliates, the trade union all over the world, and they made a statement, a common statement, saying that Merkel should stop opposing to this extension, to this TRIPS waiver, and there was a lot of movement and participation in the social networks, and many different letters were written to Merkel in order for her to stop opposing this process. And this is quite symbolic because of the amount of activities that are done. Some of them are coordinated and some of them are just not very centralized, but they actually contribute in order to have an international visibility for these different discussions. Nevertheless, the result of the meeting of the WTO General Council meeting was quite disappointing because some countries didn't actually understand the importance of having this waiver. And the European Commission was one of the main actors in that respect. And the United States is not very much involved in those debate discussions and hasn't actually assumed a role that could facilitate a constructive dialogue with the European Union. And here to finish, I would like to show you the agenda. So the WTO will have a recess during August, and the series of meetings will start in September, and we hope that we will have a full agenda that could be similar to what happened before, including different discussions of small, informal group meetings and different TRIPS council meetings. Anyway, so we expect to have a new decision in that respect. So it is important to say that we want to maintain the pressure on them and to pay attention on this important theme, given that if we lose time, we will lose our battle against the pandemic. So let's continue in contact, let's keep our contacts and keep pressing on this agenda. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, Susanna, for this excellent presentation of the international context that will be really important in the next speeches. And I will pass the floor to Clara Alves from our working group on intellectual property, and she will talk about the national environment after this excellent introduction. I'll pass the floor. I would like to say hello. My name is Clara Alves, and I worked at I am an assistant at the Working Group on Intellectual Property. And as he said, this is a group of organizations, social movements, and specialists that work to mitigate the effects of the pharmaceutical industries and the different rights of intellectual property of the pharmaceutical industry. It is important to emphasize that our working group on intellectual property 3, please close your microphones. Well, the creation of this working group on intellectual property and the different articulation from the very beginning of the 2000s has to do and is a consequence of this global movement of actors. So when we have many different activist groups and organizations that are interested.
Susana, si puedes mutear el micrófono, porfa.
Okay.
Obrigada, Suzana.
Thank you, Susanna.
Bom, então, continuando.
So,
A criação do GTPI no Brasil, né?
so the creation of the Working Group on Intellectual Property in the beginning of 2000 is part of an international journey that has to do with the work of different social movements and activists with intent of denouncing the impact of the property and intellectual property in health, the health system. It isn't just done here in Brazil, as we have seen with Suzanne and with her participation, where she belongs to international movement of public trade unions. This whole movement actually affected many different other countries like India, South Africa, Argentina, Thailand. This network we called a global access movement that we can say that started at the beginning of the 80s, 90s, when we had the AIDS pandemic and killed many people in all over the world, not only in Brazil. And we realized that it was necessary to have access to technology and medication as a means to assuring right to health. But in that time, the new medication was very, very expensive, and the patents, because of the patents, the monopolies of the industries created a very, very expensive prices. So the movement of access to which the Working Group on Intellectual Property in Nabia actually belong, always try to work and improve and develop health systems based on universal access, social participation of civil society during the construction and implementation of public policies. And one of the priorities is how to have an open access to scientific research, all the tools and all the knowledge that is necessary for the development of these essential technologies. So, in these first years, at the beginning with the AIDS pandemics, in these 4 decades, it always has been very important. It was an important struggle. But nevertheless, in 2020, the COVID pandemics, those elements, they started become even stronger. And never before we have seen such a denial of access to health technology. And the numbers that Susanna brought are very important in order to be able to qualify this inequity. Because we have so many countries that have a very weak vaccination programs and have, for example, problems even in terms of access to, for example, ventilators or COVID kits. And some northern countries like United States and Europe already are finishing their vaccination campaigns. And they already opening society. They are decreasing social distancing, masks, and things like that. So we can see this inequity very clearly. And we have numbers in terms of the development of the disease, but also in terms of death of many people. Given that the pandemic actually increases this damage, the access to the medication that already was articulated when fighting patents is now articulated in terms of struggling against the effects of the pandemic, so when related to intellectual property. And this global effort occurs all over the world, developing many different initiatives, like, for example, the initiative of the TRIPS waiver that Susanna just presented in an excellent way is an alternative to actually what we have been facing internationally. It is a proposal that is actually belongs to the council in actually trying to suspend some intellectual property rights in order to be able to have, for people to have access to all the technology. But we have different proposals, like for example, in Brazil, we have been discussing other ways of assuring perhaps the access to health, mitigating the effects of intellectual property. And within this debate, this working group on intellectual property understood that it would be important to understand the different, more important initiatives. All of them are opposed by the pharmaceutical industry, but at the same time, they are not very well understood in the media and social network, and even amongst militants and activists and important leaders that struggle for better health conditions. So within that, we developed a paper that will be published in our Brazilian Network for the Integration of People site. We are finishing it, but the debate that we do is to try to a certain extent to explain which are some of the details of each one of those initiatives, some differences, and the importance of the complementarity amongst them in order for us to be able to assure the different fronts and in order to be able to struggle in different fronts simultaneously. I think that Susanna already discussed the thrift waiver very well. So I want to contribute with our discussion on the working group on intellectual property, which is the compulsory automatic licensing process. It is important to say that in some there are different ways like networks and so on, all these questions that have to do with intellectual property and health have been called as breaking patents. This is a popular term in the media in the attempt in making this debate, in order for this debate to be easier to be digested by the general public. But this actually created a lot of confusion, and it created difficulties for our work. So what we actually propose in our article and in this debate is to try to make it different in order between the different elements and to explain the importance in every front. The TRIPS waiver is an example in Brazil and in different countries as well. We have been working with the compulsory licensing, but we have been working in Brazil a lot for this compulsory licensing. This would be flexibility of the rules of the TRIPS agreement. Why? Because even though the TRIPS could be a standard, there are some possible flexibilities that have to do with public health. So that some countries could use some different tools, some measures, some safeguards that could actually assure the right to the health in their countries. One example would be the compulsory licensing. It's not exactly breaking a patent. So the compulsory licensing is a directive from the state saying that a patent can be licensed without the authorization of the owner, in the case of a pharmaceutical lab or multinational. And based on that, we could have access to those technologies through other means, based in, for example, generic medications or the local production in the territory of the country. So this could be legislated internationally and nationally. So it is in agreement with the Constitution. There are no irregularities. It is taken into account by the Constitution, and Brazil has only been used once for the health technology in 2007 because of the AIDS pandemic, and we discussed that before. We have the favirenz, a very important medication that was very important at the time to combat AIDS. Given that the compulsory licensing was only used once, we realized that the model, the way it was basically conceived and designed in our jurisdiction wasn't enough for a COVID pandemic, because it's very bureaucratic. It really has to do with the political moment. So that's why we have many different bills that started to be analyzed in the National Congress in order to try to change the status of the compulsory licensing that has been conceived by the article number 71. And in that respect, all those projects has an objective to decrease this dependency on the executive power, transforming that into an automatic modality. That's why it has this name. It becomes, therefore, a state policy, and we would have to then, in that way, be able to decrease the bureaucracy involved. So we have been following two important projects, PL 320 and 1462. So these bills, the objective is to make the compulsory licensing, it would be possibly based on a declaration of public health emergency. So from the moment that the Brazilian state recognizes that we are living a pandemic, so we have an emergent situation, and a different addendum is that it is valid for any technology, not only vaccine. So this process isn't individual. It's not for particular for every patent. So, but you have an emergency, so you can use many different essential technologies, and that the recognition that the population has right to this access. So this compulsory licensing, automatic compulsory licensing is different from the TRIPS waiver, which is the initiative that's going to present it. In order for us not to be very technical here, it would be much more interesting for those that are interested really to analyze those technical aspects after reading our paper. But nevertheless, I can talk about some differences that are simpler, like, for example, differences in terms of the territory. For example, the TRIPS waiver has an international scope, and what we are discussing in those bills are national policies that will be only valid in Brazil. The TRIPS waiver is actually includes other aspects that go beyond patents and that have to do with intellectual property. And mostly, from the moment that we establish the possibility linked to a public emergency, it means that in the Brazilian legislation, the use of the compulsory licensing won't just be defined because of COVID-19. It will be possible to actually anticipate ourselves from the moment we see that there are other emergencies, because given all the development that we have been facing, including, for example, the environment, globalization, perhaps this can be something that we can be using more frequently, not only for the different countries, but for the world in general. It would be a way for us to anticipate ourselves in order to have the juridical tools that are necessary in order to be able to deal with the future situations. So generally speaking, what we say is that those initiatives not only the international initiative of the TRIPS waiver, but the automatic compulsory licensing, they are complementary. Because when we are living in a pandemic, all the needs, the health needs are all very urgent. They become all very urgent suddenly. So that's why we have to work in different fronts simultaneously, but they technically, one doesn't actually cancel the other, because there are different legislations ruling both, and there are different technical aspects, and they are also complementary in that respect, because there are different rights that are being used and different measures when it comes to the pandemics. So we have the COVID and the idea of leading with future emergencies. And what I think is very interesting, and I'm finishing, it is interesting to say that, and I think that Susanna left that quite clear, if we are here, if we already managed to get here, we can discuss these systems based on different articulations and the effort of the civil society on an international level, because of these global movement that was very important for the TRIPS waiver in all the different spaces, not only in the OMC, but in the national policy. We can see this debate being used in the media much more than before, and in the national sense, because our working group and all other associations and the partner movements, they supported those bills. And we have many important small victories, like the approval of the PL12, the bill. We had a historical voting process demonstrating that our effort and the importance of this theme and the fact that we insisted for so long actually was very successful. And we see an international effect and in different areas, not only in the National Congress, where we have been working a lot, but also in other spaces. This year, for example, we have victories in the judiciary system, because it's another debate, which is the end of the extension of patents, and also in the executive, and mainly in terms of public opinion and the national debate as well. So what we want to say is that all those fronts have been very important, and in terms of victories, apart from the bill, is the fact that this debate has been progressing. And based on that, I mean, from the moment that we have the possibility of people, not only in legislative environments, but in the universities and other environments, people actually start becoming aware of the effects of intellectual property. And with those small victories, we could actually add new things. We discussed in the paper, for example, the possibility of having, for example, a complete suspension of the TRIPS agreement for technologies that have to do with health. Or, for example, other fronts, like, for example, the different extinction in different agreements, and other developments of research. I mean, the fact that we're facing of the pandemics together with the work of this 30, 40 years has made it possible to reach this point in which we created more awareness, but it means that we can already think about new initiatives that can, in fact, define the end of those effects when it comes to health. I think that I finish here and we will continue with the debate later. Excellent. Thank you very much, Clara, for your very interesting and clarifying speech. Thank you very much for summing up so many different aspects and the fact that you complemented all these aspects like what Susanna said. And before I actually pass the floor to Daniel Dourado, I would like to pass the floor to Pedro Villardi, who will be the moderator. Pedro, I pass you the floor. Hello, good morning to all. Sorry, I'm late. I would like to thank Alain for having assumed this role. I would like to thank Susanna and Clara for what they have said. I was able to watch a bit of Susanna and the whole of Clara. Once again, I would like to thank you for your participation in the name of the Working Group on Intellectual Property, and I would like to pass the floor to Daniel Dourado. Thank you very much for being here with us today. It is the first time that the professor is here in our event of the Working Group on Intellectual Property and the Brazilian Network for the Integration of Peoples. We have exchanged through Twitter some information, and now we could hear a few words on what Clara said and Susanna said. Professor, please. I would like to listen to your comments, and Alain, please stay in order to help me with the questions later on. Hello, thank you very much for the invitation from the Brazilian Network for the Integration of Peoples and the Working Group on Intellectual Property. It is a great pleasure to be here with you. It's a subject that's very important. It is on the agenda of global health. It is important to really discuss the questions that have to do with intellectual property. It is a crucial theme that is now on the agenda when we're talking about the pandemic. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Pedro and Alain, for the moderation, Susanna and Clara. My idea here is to make a general comment on the importance of this agenda, and specifically when we're talking about global health. And where are we in Brazil now? Basically, why are we talking about intellectual property when we're talking about the COVID pandemics? I think that Susanna and Clara made it very clear. What is the phase we are in and why it became so important? So the pandemics is only going to be controlled when all the countries have most of their population with the jabs. And this has been discussed from the very beginning of the pandemics by the World Health Organizations and different actors. It is impossible to have the concentration of a pandemic control. And we have seen that very clearly because the new variants of concern are emerging, and they will continue to emerge because this is a normal, because the virus will have mutations, and those variants can even actually decrease the effects of the strategies of vaccination. And not talking not only about the rich countries, because we don't even need to think in altruistic terms, in terms of the global structure, but the rich countries, they have to be concerned even with vaccination strategies. Of course, that's not what we have to use primarily, but it has to be in our agenda. We need an egalitarian distribution of vaccination, technology, etc. Clara said it very clearly that this can be used, and we hope so. And in order for this debate to be able to progress, when we're talking about intellectual property for goods that have to do with health. Of course, we're talking specifically about COVID because that is the agenda now, but we have to take into account that this can also be important for the debate to progress. And we have seen that in the World Trade Organization, it could be an impulse for debates that can go beyond. Very well. We have seen that we have two different strategies that are complementary, and that became quite clear in the presentation. The TRIPS waiver, I know that it doesn't encompass the whole phenomena, but here in Portuguese we say the suspension of the patents, but we have been using this translation, which is not the translation, because we're talking about the suspension of some elements of the TRIPS agreement. But it will be a temporary suspension of the patent that has to be included in the legislation of the different countries. And one measure that we have been discussing here in Brazil is the compulsory licensing when we're talking about public health emergencies. So we have to actually to facilitate this whole process for a public health emergency. As I said before, the pandemic it makes it quite clear that this logics of this concentration logics that has to do with the economic system doesn't solve and doesn't bring a good response for the pandemic. Whilst we have this distribution of 75% of the vaccination concentrated in 10 countries or only in central countries, the pandemic won't be controlled. For us to understand, for example, now we are talking in the last week of July of 2021, a bit more than 7 months of vaccination campaigns, mainly in the rich countries. We are reaching 28% of the population with one jab, but 14% of the world population, but 1% of countries, of poor countries. There are countries, very poor countries, that almost didn't start the vaccination campaigns. They haven't even vaccinated health professionals. So basically, this logic of concentration, and we have seen that at the G20, where there was this document on the alliance of vaccines. It showed the new billionaires of the pandemics. So we have 9 people that became billionaires due to the pandemics because of, so they concentrated money because of the pandemic, apart from the other 8 billionaires that became richer. So if we take only the fortune of these 9 billionaires, $20 billion would be enough to vaccinate all the poor countries that I mentioned. So we're seeing an economical and that concentrates the resources. So this system won't give the answers, and differently from different situations in which we see an economical system that has no stimulus to change, I usually make a comparison. For example, we have enough food to exterminate hunger in the world, but that's not enough. We've enough vaccines enough for everybody, but this isn't enough for the whole population to be vaccinated. So we are seeing the rich countries already talking about the 3rd doses, but whilst a part of the world population hasn't even received the 1st jab. So we have some initiatives in the sense, for example, I mentioned, for example, the G20 meeting, but a bit later in May or June, and the World Health Assembly, there was a demonstration, and that was something used with the IMF and the World Bank, and that was new in terms of trying to find funds for the egalitarian distribution of vaccines, we think that approximately $50 billion would be enough to achieve the goal of the WHO vaccination goals. I mean, it would be 30–40% of the population of the world. But apart from that, it is very important to have an impulse in the debate that we're having right now. Why? Because at first, on a short-term basis, it makes sense to think about this initiative of the WHO together with the IMF and the World Bank to get the funds to distribute vaccines. But this doesn't solve the logics that I mentioned, which is a concentrating logics by itself. And the markets, they function like that. And we can see only that the pandemics just makes it clearer. So with the vaccination, it is quite clear. If this isn't solved, the pandemics won't be controlled, even in those rich countries that managed already to reach 60 and 70% of the population. Differently from the analogy that I just made, when I made a comparison with the hunger, that unfortunately has no stimulus, we have the vaccination. It's the concern of the central countries in actually stimulating this distribution to protect their own vaccination strategy. So this agenda is happening now, but still in a quite small way. There has been an attempt, for example, in discussing that at the G7. We have had a change in the correlation of different forces because of the change of attitude of the United States. So the debate still has to progress, and in that respect, Suzanne already showed the agenda, and we hope that until the end of the year, we will have some news on that respect. But the control is, it is very important for this debate to progress. Why? Because in order to be able to produce vaccines, products that actually go beyond those big industries. I mentioned the billionaires, and the new billionaires are the ones that actually developed a new technology, which is the RNA messenger technology. Everybody knows Moderna and Biotech for the Pfizer jab. So those are the main ones that actually concentrated all these resources. And apart from that, we have different entities that actually financed the whole process and had returns on investment. But most of this technology has been developed by public funds, meaning there has been an incentive, a public incentive from the different countries for the development of those technologies that now this benefit, the financial benefit, is incorporated based on a concentration of capital. So if we need to progress on this debate in order for those technologies, that's what I said on a medium term basis, because the waiver won't solve the problem for the next month, for the development of jabs, but nevertheless, the other jabs that already have replicable technologies can be developed in different places or in more places or in different countries. And this will make it cost effective. It will increase the access and the production capacity, because the possibility of that, of public funds, which is very important, and actually gathering funds for the distribution of jabs, which is something that is important on a short-term basis, is not a solution on a medium and long-term basis, because we have the concentration in a very few companies, and this will be restricted by those companies. Therefore, while those companies actually explore the prices of monopoly, they don't have an incentive to actually produce more, because they always find a balance of their profits. And this is not a scale that actually will fulfill the needs of the whole world. So to which extent this event actually, to which extent will these initiatives actually reach the people? Because that's the idea. In order for people to be able to pressure, in the case of Brazil, for example, I participated in many initiatives in actually working for the different bills, for the automatic compulsory licensing, for example. The public needs to understand, people need to understand that this will benefit everybody. So there is a logic that concentrates medication vaccines, and this logic can be changed. And then we're talking, as Clara mentioned very well, that doesn't go against the legislations that exist of what is happening in Brazil, 462 bill, for example. All these bills, they are in line with a possible project of things that have been foreseen by the TRIPS and by the legislation in general. So we don't need to change the constitution. It is something that can be done. So such initiatives, they can complement each other. We're talking about something that has to do with a debate at the World Trade Organization, the TRIPS waiver. This will be incorporated by the countries. It will allow for a better distribution on a medium and long-term basis. And this is crucial. And this has to be part of a global agenda of the G7, because, as I just mentioned, it makes no sense that few companies will be the ones that they will incorporate what they gained because of the pandemics, whilst most of the population in the world is vulnerable, without access to the vaccine, without access to treatment, and without access to what actually can exterminate the pandemics. So I know that we have a few minutes for the debate. I just would like to give the opportunity for us to be able to talk about that. And my idea is to try to gather these two speeches and to explain why we should reach people and why we should bring this debate for the people to be able to understand what has happened, because based on that, we will be able to make pressure, and in our case, for the approval of the laws, and in terms of global health. So we will be able to increase the debate in order to get more visibility, in order because that's how we can actually make the debate gain more terrain without disputing, because otherwise people just will follow the establishment. So I would like to thank again for the opportunity. For those who don't know, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Daniela Dourado, and I'm a doctor, and I'm a lawyer, and I work with sanitary rights from the University of São Paulo. And today I'm a visiting researcher at the University of Paris. So I have been written and I have been discussed of vaccines. I have been discussed what we are discussing here now, because all our research agenda is concentrated on COVID. So I'm here at your disposal, and I hope that we can progress with some questions and with the discussion. Thank you very much, Danielle. I would like to apologize because I should have done a brief introduction. Sorry. We have little time, and because of the people that are working with us with translation, we have 10 minutes. I just would like to very briefly tell Susana, Clara, and Danielle, I would like to pass on 3 questions. And if I could very briefly draw a parallel with your analogy of hunger, the lack of access to food and lack of access to the jabs, we can see like the power of the corporation and how the neoliberal mentality operates. Because if in area of food security. We have a lot of stimulation for the agribusiness, even if we are affecting the rainforest, the quality of the soil, the cultures of the population, traditional populations are affected, but that isn't translated in food security. But it's just an incentive for more money. It is the same way through the monopoly for this pharmaceutical industry. This isn't translated in the right to health. So that's why we need, and I think when we actually, when we prepare, by preparing our assembly, we have to work of our this struggle for health and for food security, because we're talking about ways of privatizing life and democracy that has to do exactly where these big corporations take over public resources. And I think that we are preparing the assembling of the Brazilian Network for the Integration of Peoples. And I would like to leave here two questions, and I won't be very delicate, please be brief, because we have to finish because of the translation. So very objective. What is the relation between the price of the vaccines and the medication and the compulsory licensing? Why, when we're talking about compulsory licensing, we're talking about the reduction of prices? And what has been done in terms of the transparencies of the costs of the development of the companies that benefited from the public investment? That's what I was mentioning when researching a medication and vaccines for the pandemic. So please, Clara, Daniel, and Susana, please, we could start perhaps the other way around. Susana, Daniel starts, then Clara, and Susana finishes. And if you could already close, wrap up, that would be important. Could I start, Pedro? So the question has to do with transparency. Transparency doesn't exist. I mean, we don't have that. That happens with all areas. Public investment exists in all the development of technology. We know that R&D is done by the private sector, but is stimulated by the public sector. But this transparency doesn't really disseminate. It doesn't exist. What we have is that this technology is taking over. So briefly, that would be it. And the first question, I think that I already mentioned that in my speech. I already talked about that.
Você quer algumas palavras de encerramento, Daniel?
You want to close? We have little time. No. I would like to thank again, and I'm here at your disposal, and I'm here to participate in the future debates and demonstrations. Okay, sorry. It is important for us to be a bit strict. Okay, Clara. So I think that the first question was something that we have been working on from the beginning of our activities, where the compulsory licensing will generate competition and will decrease prices. So basically, that's the idea in terms of the licensing. And in terms of transparency, I will try to be very brief. And it has to do with what Daniel mentioned in terms of the different countries and the different organizations in which they try to gather more funds to be able to distribute more vaccines. I think transparency is something that we do not have in all those policies that have been combating the pandemics. And I would like to say that the pharmaceutical companies are the ones that are actually guiding how the initiatives are happening. They are controlling the different agreements. They are leading And they are the ones that are deciding who is going to answer or to respond to the pandemic. And this is very clear. COVAX, for example, and which is the institution that today became responsible for the distribution of jabs, but is an institution that is a public-private partnership, but nevertheless, it is under the control of big companies that are the ones that will decide how the programs, the distribution programs will be done. And we are actually detached from this whole process. So that happens within the COVAX agreement. This is a clear case of the neoliberal logic, actually giving more priority to these bilateral agreements instead of having mechanisms that could be controlled by the state. In that way, it could be more possible for the public to have access to the decision-making spaces in a more egalitarian way. Unfortunately, this is not the case with the pandemics and the way that COVAX works internationally. I think that's it. Thank you very much, Clara. Susana, please. Please be brief in order to be able to finish. I would like to make a link between the importance of the jab and the problems with privatization, because we have seen that the research in the public institutions has been very important for the development of new technologies for vaccines. And it means that it is very important to have public universities, public education. When, for example, when we see the case of the researcher of Pfizer, Katarina Kariko, from Bulgaria, the history or her history shows that there are many things that are impacting the universities. And to a certain extent, it shows the importance of being able to finance the public institutions for them to be able to continue to fulfill the role of progressing in research that at first don't seem to have a commercial capacity, but that are crucial for the progress that will be used later on. I would like to emphasize the importance of those struggles against privatization in the educational sector, mainly the university education, but through the different systems all over the world, and basically public services. So that's how I would want to conclude. Thank you very much, Susana. I think that I would like to thank both of you and Danielle for having been brief in your final comments. And with that, I would like to close our debate, thanking very much Clara, Susana, and Danielle for participating and for your comments. I would like to invite all of you to visit our site of the Brazilian Network for the Integration of Peoples, and you can read Clara's papers and other articles on things that have to do with human rights related to commerce that are being elaborated for our assembly that will happen next month in August. And I would like to invite all of them to visit our site of the Working Group on Intellectual Property. So we have @GTPI, and we will put all the information on things that are related to the access to medication, intellectual property, compulsory licensing, as we have discussed. And Susanna recalls that also the International of Public Services, and Susanna also sent many different materials here on the chat. You can see them, that we'll try to share, and we will try to find the best platform to share the materials that Susanna shared in order for all of you to be able to profit from them. So these live will be recorded, so you can share them with your friends. Thank you very much. See you later.